Join me in welcoming them.
You can hear me. I won't do the normal thing of tapping. Okay. The growth of China. We're here on waters of contention, Asia's Faultlines. The growth of China and how it intends to use its economic, diplomatic and military power is probably the biggest long-term story of the next 20 years or more. Trump will one day go. Britain will or won't settle into Brexit, in or out of Europe's in the next year or two. But China's emergence as the dominant world power will go on and on. Last week I was at a top international conference in Delhi, where it was clear that the rest of the world has little idea how to respond, except to try to persuade China not to be too disruptive as it pushes its way into an increasingly dominant role in the world's international affairs, disrupting established institutions, trampling on trade routes and building its own alternatives. Asia's waters is one area where China's muscle is being felt most. Water in the sense of the seas that it's claiming far beyond its legitimate territory, and waters in the sense of the massive rivers that is damming high up in the Tibetan plateau that will immediately affect neighboring countries. These issues have been regularly in the news as China has set up bases in the Spratly and Paracel Islands, bullying and seducing nearby countries not to object too strongly. Most recently, it's been developing its Belt and Road Initiative, otherwise known as One Belt, One Road, an international project for highways, railways and pipelines moving from Asia across to Europe. We've got here a really expert panel. We always say that on every panel, but this panel really is an expert panel. We've got Brahma Chellaney, who's flown in specially from Delhi, not that far away, but still on one day to fly in and fly out again is great. He's probably India's best informed writer and academic on strategic international affairs and a speciality on the rise of China. His last book was Water, Peace or War. And he's a hawk, I think, on policy. Then there's Manoj Joshi on my left, a well-known writer and journalist and a specialist on security and defense matters. And the other two panelists were with me in London in the summer when at the Jaipur Lit Fest at the British Library we ran the same subject, but we brought in more experts to back us up this time. From the last time, there's Humphrey Hawksley, an author and former BBC journalist whose postings have included Beijing and briefly India when I first met him, when he was expelled from Sri Lanka in the 80s for whatever he was reporting in Sri Lanka. His next non-fiction book is actually the basis of this part of this session, Asian Waters. I don't think he's got a thing to hold up to show us what it's going to look like, but Asian Waters will be out in the next few months, and his latest novel, a thriller, Man on Ice, is just out. Everybody else has written books as well. Michael Buckley there is an expert on the region's rivers who's flown in from Hong Kong for the festival, and he's a specialist on Meltdown in Tibet, as one of his books was called. I'm going to ask each of them an initial question and then go into a discussion, opening it all up to you after that to see where we get to. Let me start with you, Brahma. Could you quickly map out your view of China's ambitions and India's responses over the broad spectrum, and whether China's rise, as my conference last week seemed to indicate, is now just inevitable?
First, I'm very happy that we have a session that fuses riparian issues, that is freshwater issues, with maritime issues. As Asia illustrates, riparian and maritime issues have common linkages. And we have to look at riparian and maritime issues in a larger geostrategic perspective. Internationally, maritime issues, especially maritime issues that relate to South China Sea and East China Sea, attract far greater attention than riparian, that is freshwater issues. That's largely because of the fact that maritime issues affect even outside powers, because they potentially affect sea lane safety and freedom of navigation. But in terms of actual impact, riparian issues affect a large number of more people than maritime issues because, as you know, fresh water is critical for lives and livelihoods. There can be no economic activity without fresh water. Now, if you look at the Asian picture, what's unique about the Asian picture is that China is the dominant hydro-hegemon. It has 12 downstream neighbors that depend on river flows that originate on Chinese-held territory. And this riparian status of China is unique, not because of geography, but because of guns. In 1950-51, when China annexed the Tibetan Plateau, it changed the water map of the entire Asian continent. So countries that stretch from Afghanistan to Vietnam now depend on river flows that originate on the Tibetan Plateau. In addition, by occupying Xinjiang, it became the source of cross-border river flows to Kazakhstan and Russia. So it's apparent from this larger picture that China is central to the riparian picture as well as to the maritime picture, because what China is doing in the South China Sea, and Humphrey was going to explain in detail as to what is happening in the South China Sea, by changing the status quo in the South China Sea, attempting to change the status quo in the East China Sea, and playing an increasing role in the Indian Ocean. All these underscore the fact that China is central both to maritime and riparian issues. And therefore, bringing China on board, making China accept rules-based cooperation and competition in Asia holds the key to an Asia that is stable, an Asia that will continue to prosper. But if China continues to pursue a unilateralist approach, then we're going to see conflicts arise in Asia. Let me stop here.
Okay, Humphrey, can you explain the South China Sea to us, and that's going to include some slides.
Yes, do we have the slides? Thank you, John. Do we have any slides up?
Humphrey's going to explain the constructions.
I'll begin explaining it without the slides, and if they come up, we can hope for the best.
It's there. Oh, that's the wrong one. That's his.
Shall we do mine
No, you
first?
carry on. Can you flick on and try and find it?
All right.
All right, give it to Michael. Michael's going to do rivers. Sorry, technology is
jump in. Can you hear down the back? It's okay. So you said to map things out, so we're going to map things out a little bit.
Now we've gone onto a dam.
Oh, let's go back one. Back.
Oh. I knew this was a bad idea when they suggested it.
Which one do I press to go back?
On the right.
Right.
On the left.
Left. Okay, we're just going to map things out quickly. And if there's one word you take away from this, from what I'm talking about, it's the question of scale. There is no parallel anywhere on the planet with what is happening in Tibet. All the rivers are coming from Tibet. They all go down in about 9 or 10 different nations. China has the upper ground, which means it can control every single river coming out of Tibet. So that's already a big scale. But what China has in mind for these rivers is mind-boggling. It's going to dam them. It's going to divert them. The biggest water diversion projects on the planet are going to be on these rivers. So we're not talking small potatoes here. These are massive dams, mega dams, and China runs more than half the world's biggest dams. More than half the world's biggest dams are in China. So it's a question of scale. There's nothing wrong with dams, but it's the question of scale, what's happening to the rivers. So these rivers have been flowing downstream for thousands of years, and suddenly they're not running the same way anymore. So that means you've got a big problem with food security, you've got a big problem with water security.
How many dams are there on the various rivers? Can you pinpoint maybe?
Across the Himalayas, there's probably...
You could walk over there and point.
Well, that's a little bit tricky.
Or maybe not.
If I had a laser pointer. Across the Himalayas, there's probably 100 dams projects underway in different countries. There's Pakistan being built by China. There's Nepal, China and India. There's Arunachal Pradesh, India. Bhutan, Indian dams. And then the rest are practically all Chinese, including Cambodia. But if you look at Cambodia, they depend heavily on fishing. And China's building dams in there that's going to destroy the fisheries. But the locals are not consulted. Their protests are ignored. This just goes on and on. But anyway, I just want to go to the next picture. How do we get the next picture? Right-hand side, okay. Which way am I pointing? Oh, there. This is called Shawan Dam. It's 4.2 gigawatts, which may not mean too much to you, but that is the height of the Eiffel Tower, that dam. It's the biggest arch dam in the world. There are 6 of these in Yunnan, and that is not the biggest one. The biggest one is Nouzadou, which is 5.8 gigawatts. You know, the biggest dam in the world in 1930 was Hoover Dam. That was 2 gigawatts. This thing is double that size.
Now, tell us what good and what damage this dam is doing.
Well, it will destroy fisheries because the fish cannot migrate. It will block silt, and silt is essential for agriculture, essential for mangroves.
In China, where it is, or further down?
Well, it will turn the upstream section into a lake, basically. And when you have 6 of them, they're a cascade, you've got a series of lakes. It's not a river anymore, right? So that's the damage that it's done. It's a scale, right? So if you had a small-scale dam with no reservoir, that'd be okay. But the fact is that it's a huge dam. But anyway, I've said quite a little enough. I think we should move along.
Brahma, just picking you up on this, you wrote an article recently somewhere about black water flowing out of one of the dams. Can you... out of one of the rivers?
Well, that's the main artery of the Brahmaputra River, the Siang River. That river has mysteriously turned dark and gray. And the cause of the contamination of the Siang River is still not known. The Chinese are being pretty opaque about it. The Brahmaputra, as you know, is the main river of northeast India, but it's the single biggest source of drinking water for Bangladesh. So whatever happens on the Brahmaputra upstream in Tibet, the greatest impact will be felt by Bangladesh. But this Siang River, which is the main artery of the Brahmaputra, turning black virtually, and China not explaining why it has turned black. They belatedly said in end of December that a quake that struck that area on November 18th might have led to the turbidity in the waters of the Siang River. Might have led. But actually the waters of the Siang turned black much before the earthquake struck that area. So something fishy is happening upstream in Tibet that China is engaged in, something about which China is refusing to be, transparent about.
Okay, Humphrey, why don't you just go ahead whether or not we get the thing.
Do we have the slides or not? We do. I'll just, if we get the pictures up, but essentially you saw from Michael's map the South China Sea there that was a sort of horseshoe-shaped cow's tongue, as they call it, which China has become the lightning point of China's expansion.
There's your book cover.
Here we go, we're good. So I've been researching this book, and it's out shortly for the past 18 months, and I'm going to try and tell you stuff that I didn't know when I started researching it, although I thought I knew everything.
What's the picture on the map? Oh, it's gone now.
So this is the cow's tongue, it's called, and that red line, which is also the 9-dash line, the Vietnamese call it the cow's tongue, is the sovereign territory that China claims. And this is disputed by just about everybody apart from China and Taiwan. Now you'll see on the left top-hand side you have the Paracel Islands, and then down the bottom you've got the Spratly Islands. These are 2 places that the Chinese have militarized in the past 3 to 4 years at a very rushed speed. The Paracel Islands there you'll see are very close to Hainan Island, which is where they have a very big submarine and military base. Now, to give you an idea of the Chinese thinking on this, they have wanted to do this for 200 or 300 years. They call it the Great Wall of the Sea. In the 18th century and before that, they gave themselves buffer states along the northern, they did Tibet, they did Xinjiang, they did Mongolia, they did Manchuria, and that was to keep that Han Chinese population safe from foreign invaders. They failed to do that in the 19th century when the British came in with the Opium Wars in 1839. They went through what they called a century of humiliation when they were colonized until Mao took over. And then we know the upheavals then. And it wasn't until Deng Xiaoping came into power in 1979 and the economy started, they were able to think again about their Great Wall of the Sea. This is a place called Mischief Reef that's in the Spratly Islands in 1995. And you can see there it's just shacks, bamboo stilts, and that was ostensibly to give fishermen a sanctuary. This is Mischief Reef in 2012. A satellite picture, slightly different, not much there. It looks like a tropical lagoon from a holiday brochure. And then if you look at it in 2017, 5 years later, and we can talk about the impetus and catalyst that produced this, you can see here they've got a runway, they've got hangars for aeroplanes, they've got radar, they've got all that is needed for a military base in just 5 years. 7 of the Spratly Islands have been militarized like this in the same period of time. On the Paracels, this is Woody Island. It's always been quite well developed. They took it originally from the Vietnamese in 2 stages, 1976 and 1974, 1956, and they had a runway and a fishing village and stuff there, but this is it in 2017. The same sort of stuff, radar, hangars, and all the rest of it, with a fighter plane about to take off from the runway. So what you've got here, if you've got one of the world's crucial fishing routes, trillions of dollars of trade going through every year, if that was stopped, the whole world would shake for all of us. You've got China wants to control this, America doesn't want it to control it, and then its arc of influence would seep through into the Indian Ocean and beyond. Thank you very much.
What's China's end game?
What's China's
End game. What's it all about?
End game is to secure its trade routes and to secure its population. Now, in order to do that, as we know from history, this is what big powers do. So when the Americans kicked out the British and Latin America was kicking out the European colonizers, in 1825 it created the Monroe Doctrine. And it did a similar thing here in the Caribbean. And it said any power that tries to move into the Caribbean, it will be a hostile power. Russia is doing pretty much the same and has done the same thing as the Soviet Union right now up in the North Atlantic and the Barents Sea, where it has what it's called its bastion of control or bastion of defense. Same as what China has created in the South China Sea. I think the key point to this, John, is that this isn't a maverick dictator. This isn't good against evil. This is a real, solid, mature power that any general or admiral looking at how it needs to protect its people and protect power would do exactly what China has done in the South China Sea.
Great, thank you. Brahma, where do they get the technology from? Where did they learn how to build the dams and how to build the stuff on the islands? I mean, they didn't have the China didn't have the technology to begin with. What happened?
Well, there are 2 things to keep in mind, that for nearly 40 years now, China is a country led by engineers. Ever since Deng Xiaoping became the paramount leader of China in 1978, as you might recall, he became the paramount leader by isolating Mao's chosen successor. It was a vicious power struggle in which Deng triumphed. When he triumphed, he couldn't rely on the old guard. So he got rid of the old guard and brought in new faces. The new faces were technocrats, mostly engineers. So starting with Li Peng being the premier, and then the state council being dominated by engineers, right through till now, Xi Jinping. You have had a succession of engineers. Xi Jinping is a chemical engineer. His predecessor, Hu Jintao, was a hydro engineer. Hu Jintao's predecessor, Jiang Zemin, was an electrical engineer. The premier, Wen Jiabao, who was premier for 11 years, he was premier for 11 years, he was also an engineer. So in a country that dominated by engineers at the top leadership, engineers, as you know, are supply-side people. You have a problem, you go to an engineer, what does the engineer do? Engineer seeks to create a structure to resolve an issue. They look only at the supply-side mechanics of a problem. That's one factor that is driving China's frenzied land reclamation in the South China Sea or its dam building frenzy. The second issue which you ask, where did they get the technology? It was a slow learning process. In the case of building dams, they didn't have the expertise to build large dams. They began building medium-sized dams. They began seeking contracts for dams overseas. And they won a number of contracts in Africa and Southeast Asia. And they sent hundreds of their engineers to work on these overseas projects. When these engineers learned the ropes, they were brought back to work on dams at home. Similarly, on land reclamation, they began land reclamation activities on a slow pace. They trained the engineers how to do land reclamation in the South China Sea. Once they mastered the art, then they went into a frenzy. For example, between 2013 and 2015, in just 3 years, China created 7 artificial islands in the South China Sea. And by the time Obama left office at the end of 2016 or beginning of 2017, they had militarized all 7, literally all 7 of those artificial islands. Goes to show that once they master the technology, then they apply it with full passion and with full speed.
I mean, China's ability to do this sort of thing is extraordinary. I mean, on defense, they've become one of the world's biggest defense manufacturers, having been the world's biggest defense importer of defense equipment just 3 or 4, 5 years ago. And they've swung from being a huge importer to an exporter. I mean, it's quite remarkable. Would you like to pick up on that one?
See, the thing is
you
that...
right about defense? I mean, we didn't plan to discuss this, but just one little capsule to follow on from the point about
the thing is that what China has been doing is it has a kind of a 40-year plan. In the sense, many of the things that China has done, we began in the 80s, modernization, Rajiv Gandhi wanted computerization, mission areas were identified in certain areas but somehow or the other, India kept stumbling. We had a crisis in 1991, Rajiv was assassinated, and then again our politics went into a tailspin. So where China has, I went to Xi'an industrial zone, a high-tech zone. They told me that they have 30,000 companies from all over the world in that one of 6 high-tech zones in China. But they said in 1990 they only had 6. So they've been systematically, the thing about the Chinese, and I think Brahma described that process, they've been very systematic about it. And mind you, defense was the last of their 4 modernizations. Meaning they said that we'll first build up other areas, then we'll go into defense, and that's what they've done right now.
And India is still debating special economic zones and not sure how to do them.
Yes, we're still debating them, and getting land for them is a major headache.
Okay, the next point we were going to move on to, which we will, is how is India reacting to all that we've heard? Badly, I assume.
Well, India has been tardy. I mean, all of us here, many of us are Indians, and we all know that we just simply getting our act together is always the problem. Building roads in the border areas. We've been doing it for 3 decades, 4 decades, and the roads haven't been built.
Wasn't the line once that we shouldn't build roads on this side because it would make it easy for China when they got to the border to run into India?
Yes,
whereas
absolutely.
they build the roads on the other side so they can get to the border.
Well, but what India is trying to do now is really get into coalitions. In the sense, when we look at this Brahmaputra problem, which Brahma spoke of, under international law, we don't have much of a leg to stand on. International law is very weak in this. So we got to get a coalition of countries, and so they are Mekong countries, meaning countries like Vietnam, Cambodia, Laos, Thailand, Myanmar, because they also are downstream countries from the Mekong. And the Chinese are doing to them what they are doing to us in the Brahmaputra is happening in the Mekong, perhaps at a faster pace. And so we need to build coalitions with them. We are trying to do that to deal with the river problem. Then when it comes to the South China Sea, etc., what we've done is we are building coalitions with the United States, Japan, Australia, and the ASEAN, but the ASEAN is a bit of a split reed right now. So we are trying to build coalitions to say, well, we use telegraphic language. We say that we uphold freedom of navigation and the freedom of overflight. So which means that the sea lanes cannot be dominated or controlled by China in any way. And we have to understand, of course, that we are, by ourselves, we can't do it. It is something which requires an effort. And the United States and Japan also look to India in this direction because they realize that the only country which can possibly offer some kind of a counterweight to China in terms of its size, in terms of its military, in terms of its economic potential is India. But we must note the important word potential. We are still a potential. We need to translate that potential into the substance, and then we have something going.
Brahma, can the potential be transferred into substance? I mean, when I was here in the 80s, all the headlines said springboard for takeoff or on the brink of takeoff. That was on industry and economy. But I mean, is India capable of responding?
First, let's remember that from the time the People's Republic of China was established in 1949 till 1985, India was ahead of China economically. Why did India slip behind China? How is it China now is 5 times larger economically than India? These are issues that have much to do with India's murky politics. India's politics in the late 80s took a very casteist inward turn. 1990s and thereafter, the 2 decades after the 1980s were decades of weak coalition governments, largely, not entirely, but weak coalition governments. The internal politics really held India down. Democracy is always a slower process, as you know, John. It's always more difficult to develop rapidly in a democratic system. Democracy remains the best system for India, but it's a system that imposes a major democracy tax on development that Indians are cognizant of. But India needs to make its system more efficient, more result-oriented. And we need to be able to implement our plans and our ideas. We often fail to translate our plans into action. That's where India's weakness lies. For example, day before yesterday, India scored a major diplomatic success by bringing to New Delhi the leaders of all 10 ASEAN leaders, all 10 ASEAN countries, the Sultan of Brunei, the prime ministers of Laos, Cambodia, Singapore, Thailand, the de facto leader of Myanmar, the prime minister of Vietnam. They were all there. Now, to have all the ASEAN leaders as chief guests at the Republic Day parade after the diplomatic feat, to translate that success into reality, into tangible gains for India's diplomacy, that is going to be a challenge for India. We tend to rest on our oars. We say, oh, what a great success it was to bring those 10 leaders to the Republic Day parade. That was not the success. The success will lie in actually creating a dynamic Act East policy, which has strategic meaning, it has economic dynamism built into it. That's the challenge for India, to translate its plans into actions and into tangible results, into benefits that make India stronger, make India more relevant, both in Asia and beyond.
Humphrey, you talked earlier about China and Russia staking out their areas of influence. Would you like to develop that on to what India has or hasn't done?
Well, yes, I think that coming on from what Brahma said, I think that there's an acceptance now that China is way ahead all around the world. I think what the countries that aren't aligned to China have yet to decide is how to deal with this. So China is building up its economy, it's built up its South China Sea, it is going to spread out into the Indian Ocean. Its businesses are going to come to India. All these things will happen. It is going to come into some sort of economic alliance with Russia on its... since the sanctions of Crimea, China has invested a lot into Russia's resources exploration and that sort of thing. That is all a given. What I think has yet to be decided by any of us is how to actually approach this. And I think that, correct me if I'm wrong, I think that in India and many countries, there's still this idea is, yes, if we tag onto the US and Japan, we can combat this. But I don't think that's the case. I think when you have a rising power, you have to find out a way to work with that power, particularly if it is more powerful than you are. And if you become a sort of supplicant to China or a supplicant to the US and Japan, you are going to be a weaker power in some sort of bloc. Now, what I see when you talk about the rules-based order here is that from Beijing's point of view, This is a rules-based order as written by the United States and the West. And this is why it moved into the South China Sea so quickly, because there was an international tribunal in The Hague, the Permanent Court of Arbitration, that was ruling on its sovereignty of the South China Sea, and it ruled against China. And China said, well, tough luck, we're here already, now deal with that. And this is what is going to happen year on year, is that China is slowly beginning to create its own rules-based order, and the weaker economies such as Laos, Cambodia, possibly my country and Great Britain and Australia are going to have to make decisions on how much they stick to their values or their security with the US and how much they bend to the way that China and the Asian values way of doing things should work.
But your basic point was that India has not staked out its area of influence.
India has not yet, you mean on the bastion of defense thing. Well, what India has failed to do, and I think we were talking about Rajiv Gandhi's assassination and that sort of thing, way back 20, 25 years ago, there was a chance possibly to have staked out, like in the South China Sea, at least an area of control. And when, in the case of Rajiv Gandhi, your former prime minister and prime minister-to-be gets assassinated by a foreign terror group that lives just across the water, you don't just let it go. You go in and get that guy. And India didn't do that. It didn't have the resolve of a power to go and protect its politicians. And it hasn't done much since. Correct me if I'm wrong, but we don't have a South China Sea in the Indian Ocean. We don't have a Caribbean controlled by the US. We don't have the North Atlantic bastion control. The Indian Ocean is still a free-for-all, which means that in the case of this, that China actually has got a port in Sri Lanka, it and Saudi Arabia control the Maldives, and so on and so forth.
Brahma, you wanted to come in, I think.
Just a quick point on rules-based order. Of course, the rules-based order is largely Western design. It was designed in the post-World War II period. But if you talk about rules that have been framed in more recent decades, rules that China has agreed to voluntarily, yet China does not adhere to those rules. UNCLOS is one example. UNCLOS was an international convention in whose negotiations China participated voluntarily and has agreed to become a party voluntarily. And yet, despite being a party to UNCLOS, it does not adhere to the letter of UNCLOS. Now, that's not a Western designed convention. It's a truly international convention. On top of that, when there was, under UNCLOS, there is a dispute settlement mechanism, because when you have a treaty arrangement or a convention, disputes will arise. For example, India has this generous water sharing arrangement with Pakistan, the Indus Waters Treaty, under which 80% of the waters of the Indus system are reserved for Pakistan's use, exclusive use. Now, there is no water sharing treaty in the world that is so generous toward a lower riparian state. And yet, disputes arise on the Indus system, and there's a mechanism under the Indus Waters Treaty. If a dispute arises, it goes to international arbitration. Now, India accepts international arbitration on the Indus Treaty. It accepts international arbitration on maritime disputes. For example, with Bangladesh, the International Arbitral Tribunal at The Hague ruled against India. 80% of the disputed area was given to Bangladesh. India accepted the tribunal's verdict. But in the case of China, under the UNCLOS, there is a dispute settlement mechanism. That dispute settlement mechanism gave an award that went against China. China trashed it publicly, called it not worth the paper on which it has been written, etc., debunked it. Now, that doesn't indicate that China believes in any rules. It's a state that increasingly is acting in a way as if rules don't matter. What matters is its own interest. Now, that doesn't create a stable world. If everybody acts in that fashion, we're going to have conflicts in the coming years. We are lucky that so far that China's unilateralism has gone unchallenged, allowing China to actually do what it has done in the South China Sea or what it's seeking to do in the East China Sea in the Indian Ocean. But looking ahead, I think what China is doing is going to provoke a reaction. And unless we can make China accept a rules-based order, we're going to see increasing conflict in the Asia-Pacific region.
But that's what people were saying at the conference I was at last week. We must hope that they'll accept a rules-based order. And they won't accept a rules-based order. You know it before you even say it.
Can I make a point?
Manoj.
The United States has not accepted UNCLOS, meaning the United Nations, Treaty on the Sea. The United States stays out of it. So big powers do what they want and get away with it. And what we are seeing is a power rising very fast. And this is because it's happening in front of us, we are outraged. But frankly, if you ask the ASEAN, if you look at the ASEAN statement on the arbitration award, I would say it's not worth the paper it was written on, meaning there was virtually no reaction.
I just want to switch to transboundary rivers. China is one of the 3 non-signatories of the UN Convention on Transboundary. The other was Turkey, and I can't remember. It took 20 years to get that piece of paper signed, and then China never signed it. But China claims sovereignty over the upper parts of these rivers to the borders, and it has no concern about what happens once that water leaves. So it says we own the rivers, and we don't care what happens downstream at all. We have no interest. As a matter of fact, we think you're wasting the water when it leaves China because you're not damming it. That's what they've said publicly. So, when you've got a mindset like that, what do? How do you stop them? So anyway, one thing that you can do, if those dams were not built in the first place, the water would go as it's supposed to go, down to the ocean, which is, we got sea level rise happening. If you don't have the water coming down the same volume, you're going to have water, the sea level is going to go higher because it's not coming down the same volume. So you got big water security and food security problems happening on the coast. And the deltas are sinking.
I was going to get you to talk about the environment impact and things, but let's just deal now with the question that you all said you wanted to answer earlier, so now let's do it. What's the solution?
Can I start with
one of you said we've got to have a few minutes on solutions. We've got plenty of time still, but what are the solutions?
I can offer
you go first since you've got the microphone.
Yeah, I can offer a few solutions. One is not to build these mega dams in the first place.
Who not?
China.
No, that's not a solution. How do you stop them?
You just, piece of paper, you cancel it.
What?
It's happened before. You can cancel the dam as it's being built.
How do you get China to cancel the dam?
They've had massive protests on the Salween River. They cancelled a
Who's going to organise the protests?
The Chinese NGOs. In the Salween River in Yunnan, Sichuan, they cancelled a cascade of 13. But now that Premier Wen Jiabao has passed away, he's lost his leadership. It was only for his reign. Then they started them again. Because these are, the dam builders have a lot of money invested in these things. Anyway,
this is the regime of Xi Jinping. This isn't the reign. The regime of Deng Xiaoping
as you said before, it's a regime of engineers.
Yeah, but driven by a guy who wants to be the top.
But anyway, mega dams is a new technology. It only basically came in the 1930s with the Hoover Dam, and then got copied. But you can have technological solutions. There have been solutions for building dams submarine under the water. Fish and silt still goes through, but you still get the power. That's a solution. But it's too expensive.
How does the world stop China building these dams?
Well, that's another question because they're not.
No, it's the solutions. You all wanted to have a session.
If China built a different design of dam,
there's nothing you can do. Under international law, the upper riparian, meaning the international law itself, is extremely weak on this. So the Chinese, they give us data for about 30, 40 days a year. They give us data on the Brahmaputra, and they make it very clear that the data is being given to us on humanitarian grounds, not on legal grounds. If you look at the press release that comes with it. So the thing is that there's little you can do. You have to take China along. You've got to persuade China, and my view is that the only way to do that is to build coalitions. In the sense, you have no other option.
With other countries.
With other, like the Mekong countries, because the Mekong countries are also affected. Laos, Cambodia, Vietnam, Myanmar, Thailand, they're all affected because they are downstream countries for the Mekong, and the Chinese are doing the same there.
And is India starting to do this?
India is not. Well, we do have something with Mekong, but
you're supposed to be the leaders of the region.
India is a bit uncertain about how to deal with China. So
India is a bit uncertain how to deal with any country.
So
why don't you look at the Brahma?
You see, because the question is, you can't use force. Force alone won't work. It's not as though Uncle Sam's going to come and help you to stop them building dams. That's not going to happen. You've got to, I think the ecological argument, and I'm now willing to take Xi Jinping at face value when he says that environment and ecology is going to be an important consideration for Chinese policy hereinafter, not because of the world, but because those policies affect China itself. You know, the smog in Beijing and all that. So the Chinese are now suddenly waking up to the idea that they have created an ecological disaster. So perhaps there would be a shift. All these shifts normally come from within, meaning you cannot force a country like China to do anything. That's not possible. It's a nuclear-armed country. It's got a big army. It's a huge economic power. So there's no question of trying to compel it to do anything. I think the only way out in these circumstances is to try to promote change within China, try to build coalitions where you can, use balance of power where you can, because power is, And do
you think India can and will do that in the foreseeable future?
I think it can happen, yes, because I think the Chinese, what Brahma just pointed out, that the Chinese are facing, at last now they're facing resistance. For the first time, the United States has said that China is a peer competitor, because till now the United States used to believe that over time China will liberalize and China will become like us, it will go by the rule of law. For the first time, the US National Security Strategy document very categorically sees China as a peer competitor and say we are going to compete. Now that should be a warning signal to China that they have reached that tipping point. They reached the tipping point with the US, they've reached it with us, they've reached it with the ASEAN, but ASEAN won't say it because they're very weak and small countries. They've reached it with Japan. So now what has happened is that you created these conditions for the coalition.
Brahma, what do you think about that? The chance of India and other countries getting together to... I mean, India's diplomacy in its own region is unsuccessful. China's moved into almost all the surrounding countries. So what chance of...
First on international law is very clear that every country has the right to utilize water resources of a shared river for its development, but it has a corresponding obligation not to cause, quote-unquote, palpable harm to a co-riparian state. That's international law. You can utilize the water that originates on your territory as long as you do not cause palpable harm to the downstream countries. Now, in the case of China, it flouts that basic principle of international law. It also flouts bilateral agreements. For example, with India, it has signed separate agreements, one on the Brahmaputra, one on the Satluj River, to share hydrological data. These are binding agreements. Last year, it did not supply any hydrological data to India, despite record flooding in Assam state. And many of the deaths in Assam were preventable had China provided hydrological data to India for flood forecasting. So this indicates again that China does not believe in a rules-based relationship with any country. Forget about a rules-based order.
The lack of information is a serious problem.
It is. But it's important to keep in mind that China will not act if it knows there will be international reaction. If there is no international reaction to its aggressive action, it tends to then take off and do what it wishes to do. When there was no international reaction to its takeover of Scarborough Shoal in 2012, it began land reclamation activity in South China Sea. When China saw there was no real reaction from the world, from the US in particular, to the start of land reclamation activity in 2013, it began land reclamation in 2014 on a frenzied scale. But where China faces reaction, it's willing to halt its activities. So creating international pressure holds the key. Getting the Trump administration to focus attention on the South China Sea has to be an important objective. Right now, the Americans have one fixation already. The fixation is Russia. Even though China is 10 times economically stronger than Russia, 10 times stronger than Russia demographically, and in terms of military spending, China is 5 times larger than Russia. And yet, if you look at American debates and American media, Russia is the #1 fixation. Now, under Trump, there's a second fixation in US foreign policy, which is North Korea. And the main beneficiary of both these fixations is China. Now, getting the Trump administration to focus attention on the South China Sea to prevent further change in the status quo on the South China Sea should become a priority for countries like India, Japan, Australia, European Union countries, because unless we do not stop the status quo change in the South China Sea, this will have far-reaching and long-term implications for international security. But in terms of solutions for fresh water, I can offer three very quick ways countries can address freshwater challenges. The first is by achieving greater water use efficiency and productivity, especially in agriculture. Agriculture consumes 80% of all water use annually in the world. So improving water use efficiency standards in agriculture holds the key. The second is using clean water technologies, especially distillation technology and membrane technology, to open up new sources of supply. This includes recycled water, which is wastewater that has been recycled after being chemically treated. Desalinated water is another source of new supply that countries can tap, as well as brackish water that has been treated. The third is creating a better and more expansive water infrastructure so as to address seasonal and regional imbalances in water availability. For example, in Asia, in the monsoons, there's too much water in the monsoon season and too little water in the dry season. The dry season in Asia is from January to May. So having improved water infrastructure capabilities can address these seasonal and spatial imbalances in water availability.
Humphrey, briefly, solutions.
I would like
in the South China Sea. I mean, in the sea.
Well, it's the South China Sea China thing. I think that if we think back into history, we have various treaties that might be familiar to us, like the Treaty of Versailles, the Conference of Vienna, the Treaty of Westphalia back in the 18th century, and the creation of the United Nations and the Bretton Woods and the present world order that we have at the moment. Each of those was created with a conference after the war, and the war took place because one side didn't want to yield if it didn't have to go to the battlefield. It only yielded after being defeated on the battlefield. I have a sense now that with this is that China is not going to change unless it feels that it's writing a new world order. And that new world order does not just include what China's involvement. There are other huge countries like India. Where is India's seat on the United Nations? Where is Brazil's seat on the United Nations? What is India doing in the International Monetary Fund? A raft of measures that over a year or even decades, you were talking about 20 years to negotiate something, could bring everybody onto a journey that they feel that they're all part of, that they're not just hitchhiking onto somebody else's world order. So if you could sit the world leaders down at a conference and you play them the carnage that could come from a war, the nuclear weapons, the refugees, and the hunger and the famine, and say, look, if we don't sort this out, this is what could happen, and then begin this journey that will settle everything down, and there would be temporary agreements on things like the dams and the South China Sea.
Okay, we're going to open it up for questions in 2 or 3 minutes, so we'll be ready. But I want to cover 2 subjects before we move on, but very quickly, which we haven't touched on, which we ought to do to complete the picture. One is ports. Manoj, can you just sketch in? I mean, there's the ports in Sri Lanka, in Pakistan, and across to the Horn of Africa. So China's building up this thing.
Well, you know, in all fairness, all great trading countries eventually end up building ports as well. And that's what China has been doing systematically around the world. But there are problems with how they do it. In the sense, in the case of Hambantota, they built the port, no one comes to the port.
In Sri Lanka.
No one comes to the port. And then when the port wasn't working, the Sri Lankans were in debt. They had to sell the port to the Chinese. The second aspect, of course, is the naval aspect. They have a port in Gwadar, and now there are reports that they are planned to build a naval facility also nearby. So the question is, the expansion, it's one thing to build ports and promote commerce. It's quite another thing to then, at a parallel level, build up naval facilities which will see the expansion of the PLA Navy into the Indian Ocean, which is definitely a matter of concern to us and to other Indian Ocean countries.
But that's separate from the Belt and Road Initiative.
Well, you know, Belt and Road Initiative virtually encapsulates everything. So there is a maritime Silk Route,
right,
which takes into account the ports and the maritime routes. So it's very much part of the Belt and Road Initiative.
Who'd like to do the Belt and Road in 2 minutes? Brahma?
Sorry?
The Belt and Road Initiative. Just speak on it for 2 minutes to explain it.
Just one point quickly on the Belt. You know, in India, there's too much of a focus on the Belt and Road Initiative on the China-Pakistan economic corridor.
Yes.
Actually, the CPEC is a very minor part of it. The real aim of the Belt and Road Initiative is to make China one pole of Eurasia. The other pole is rich Europe. And so, just as the United States' prosperity was dependent on trade with Europe, the Chinese want their prosperity, and which means from now to about 2050, they want to hook up closer to Europe because that's where the real money is.
That's
where
the point.
the real markets are.
You've done a report on this.
I've done a report on this.
So expand on it a little more.
Well, essentially the report says that the Chinese goal is that the Belt and Road Initiative is linked to their plan of enriching their economy by hooking up to rich Europe. They want to produce more innovative goods. They want to produce better quality goods. But where's the market? It's not in poor Asia. It will be in rich Europe. And Europe is the richest region of the world, which you take the EU and the non-EU countries together. They are even bigger than the United States. And so the Chinese have targeted Europe via Eastern Europe, where they have created a new grouping called 16+1 grouping. And they've got just like they have broken the ASEAN, they've also managed to create chinks in the European Union armor. And they are now politically influencing European Union via countries like Greece and Hungary. So when there are human rights issues, Hungary votes against it. When there are issues with regard to the arbitration award, which we have been talking about, one of the countries says, no, we can't take this strong position against China. So the Chinese have managed through their investment, and they've been buying up top-level technology companies in Europe, you know, at a furious rate. In 2016, meaning they bought up some of the leading robotics companies in Germany called KUKA, and they have been buying up other companies as well because the Europeans don't have rules which prevent the companies from being sold off. It's only the Americans who managed to block off some because the Americans have regulations in this context. Yes. So they are really trying to move. They're trying to move very fast by boosting the quality of their product by acquisitions of top-flight European companies. And so Europe is definitely, to my mind, the target of the Belt and Road Initiative, not Pakistan, not the Indian Ocean.
Good. Well, with that, let's open it up. You're standing. Yes. We'll take one by one to begin with, then we'll group a few. So
we acknowledge that.
No speeches, quick questions.
Yeah, just water would be an issue.
If you want to say who should answer it, please do.
Mr. Brahma and Manoj Joshi, I guess it's an Indian. The problem of water would be one of the source of the conflicts. How important is the water issue in the Kashmir conflict? And the same applies for the access of China to Arunachal and the claim of China towards the Indian territories. The water problem in the Kashmir conflict. I mean, we know that the law of water flowing to Kashmir and towards Pakistan.
Did you get that, Brahma?
If I can add to it, he's actually talking about Indus Water Treaty and its conflict with the state of Jammu and Kashmir. And one of the other issues is about the Kaveri River, which I can have a comment about that. How we in India don't have this mechanism of dealing with the conflict internally, let alone external conflicts in this regard. So if you can comment on that issues. Thank you.
Brahma, can you do that?
India being a democracy and India facing increasing water shortages, interstate water disputes have become increasingly common. For example, 3-4 years ago, Karnataka state had a one-day strike over a river water dispute with tiny Goa. And then 2 weeks earlier, there was a strike in Odisha state over a dispute over a river that it shares with Chhattisgarh state. Now these disputes, and even in those of you who live in Rajasthan, in Jaipur, know about the dispute that Rajasthan has with Haryana and Punjab over the sharing of the Indus waters. When the Indus Waters Treaty was signed in 1960, at that time there were no water shortages in India, except maybe in the Thar Desert. And people who signed that treaty did not think ahead. They did not visualize that within a generation, India will be faced with serious water shortages. So they gave away the bulk of the waters of the Indus system. 6 rivers waters, more than 80% were given away to Pakistan, and India kept for itself only 19.48% of the total waters of the 6 rivers. Today, states in the Indus basin, like Punjab, Haryana, Rajasthan, are fighting over water. Now this tells you how rapidly the situation has changed on the fresh water front. What India should do on the Indus Waters Treaty is an issue that needs sober debate, reflection. Under international law, countries enter into any treaty voluntarily, and therefore, under the Vienna Convention, no country can be stopped from withdrawing from a treaty. Nor can any party be prevented from seeking renegotiation of a treaty. Now, these are issues that need to be debated. I don't have the time to explain these complex legal issues here. But somebody asked me about Gwadar, right? Gwadar and Kashmir and all. Again, it's very difficult to provide you a quick answer. We only have 4 minutes left. But you're right that Kashmir is rich in water. The 3 large rivers reserved for Pakistan to use.
You've got 10 seconds.
Oh, okay. I'm actually happy to stop here so that others can get some time.
Okay, finish that thought.
Well, I've already said it. You know.
All right, okay. A question. Yes, the guy there, and then the lady to your right.
Well, given the global inability to tackle the rising Chinese dragon, are we looking forward to an era of American hegemony completely fading away in the decades to come?
I think American hegemony is slightly outside the subject, but let's take the other question as well.
I'm just interested what the panel thinks 2049 looks like from a Chinese expansion role in the world. Oh yeah. What does 2049 look like for a new world order or a Chinese expansion? What does the panel think 2049 looks like?
Humphrey, 30 seconds on the 2049 world order.
There'll be more or less a US-China parity if there's not fighting before then. But the key thing is around 2049, China presently has marked that precise date to be pioneering the Arctic. So that gives them a new route that they want to. They won't have the sovereignty there, but they will control it. And in order to achieve that, they'll have to stay like that with Russia.
Right, Mr. Roddy,
if China does not implode in the meantime.
Roddy, I know somebody's name at last. You can't hear you.
Commented on the Indo-Chinese border dispute, Doklam. How does this fit into what we've been talking about?
Doklam. Do you want to Doklam? 30 seconds.
Well, Doklam, frankly, Doklam is a complicated. Doklam is all about trying to push Bhutan, meaning it's not so, because Doklam itself is a dispute between China and Bhutan. India has important strategic interests in that area, but the idea was to shake up Bhutan, and I think Bhutan has been shaken up, and India needs to work hard on its Bhutanese friend, because tomorrow if Bhutan agrees to transfer Doklam to China, it'll all be over, because we don't have, that's not our territory. But we have to keep Bhutan close to us in these circumstances.
We're down to 1 minute 30. Yes.
Yeah, many of the countries where China has invested in they're now realizing that probably they're into a debt trap now. And there are voices in Pakistan who are questioning their investment. So do you think more of this is coming and maybe countries will take a back seat now and think over whether Chinese investment should be allowed?
Who wants that? You?
Actually, 3 big infrastructures projects in Pakistan, Nepal have been cancelled partly because China wanted 100% ownership of these dams and the countries were not willing to give it to them and they would not renegotiate. But I don't buy this argument that you can change China's mind, which was suggested before. Even from the inside, they've proved themselves impervious to any kind of change. They have this fixed, hardline view backed up by militarism, and they're not changing anything. They said that they agreed to the Paris Accords. What are they doing about their coal production? Nothing. They're increasing it. So I don't buy this. The number of environmental groups in China may be able to change something, but they're not doing anything on the long run.
Okay, last questions somewhere here.
My question is for Mr. Humphrey. Who owns the artificial islands built by China? Does China owns them or they're running in a conflict?
Under international law, they are international waters and China does not own them. But under Beijing law, China does own them. And that is where you have the red line that is going to cause possibly the flashpoint between the US, that has vowed to protect Southeast Asia and that region, and China that has vowed to occupy it.
That's a splendid note to finish on, the red line that moves all around the world and eventually includes the whole hemisphere. Thank you very much, everybody. Marvellous session. Good fun.